He traded his wife for his mistress, but he never expected that she would. Emily Harper was in the kitchen, stirring the soup in the pot, while glancing at the clock for the third time that night. David was late, which wasn't exactly unusual lately. Something had changed in him over the past few months, a distance she couldn't quite understand. She tried to ignore the unsettling feeling that had settled in her chest, but tonight felt different. She just knew it. The sound of the door opening and slamming shut made Emily quickly turn around. David entered the living room, his face tense with an expression she couldn't read. He didn't look at her as he hurried up the stairs. "David? What's going on?" Emily asked, her voice hesitant, fearing the answer. David didn't respond. She heard the muffled sounds of drawers opening and closing, suitcases being pulled out. Something was definitely wrong. Emily's heart began to race, and she dropped the spoon into the sink before following David upstairs. When she entered the bedroom, she saw David throwing his clothes into an open suitcase on the bed. "David, please talk to me," Emily insisted, her voice full of concern and confusion. "What's happening?" David paused for a moment, his shoulders slumped under the weight of what he was about to do. He zipped up the suitcase quickly and then finally looked at Emily. "We need to talk, Emily." There was a hardness in his voice that Emily had never heard before. "What's going on, David?" she repeated, now afraid of what he was about to say. Before David could answer, the doorbell rang, echoing through the silent house. He looked at Emily briefly, almost with pity, before heading downstairs with the suitcase in hand. Emily followed him, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. When David opened the door, Emily saw a woman she recognized only by name, Jessica, David's colleague, whom he had mentioned a few times in passing. But something was terribly wrong at that moment. Jessica entered the house with a triumphant smile, the kind that made Emily's stomach turn. "Emily, this is Jessica," David began, his voice cold, almost indifferent. "She's pregnant, and we're going to have a family." David's words hit Emily like an avalanche, leaving her stunned. She looked at Jessica, then at David, unable to believe what she was hearing. "Pregnant? How?" Emily whispered, unable to finish the sentence. Jessica, as if she had been waiting for that moment, pulled a pregnancy test out of her purse and displayed it to Emily as if it were a trophy. "It's positive," she said, her voice sweet but with a hint of cruelty. Emily felt as if the ground was opening up beneath her feet. She had always known that David wanted to have children but never imagined that he would be capable of something so cruel, so inhumane. Are you telling me that you cheated on me and now want to leave me because of her?" Emily's voice faltered, full of pain and disbelief. David, unable to face the full extent of the suffering he was causing, looked away. "Emily, I'm sorry, but I want a family, and you can't give me that." "Jessica can. We're going to have a life together, and I need you to leave the house. I'll give you a month to find a place and move out." Those words were the final blow. Emily, who had dedicated years of her life to building a home with David, was now being discarded as if she were an obstacle to be removed. She looked at David, searching for any sign of the man she loved, but found only coldness. "You're really going to kick me out of our house?" she asked, almost as if she needed to hear it again to believe it. David, still avoiding her gaze, just nodded. "The house is mine, and I'm going to need it." Emily felt the tears burn her eyes but refused to let them fall in front of David and Jessica. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. "Fine," she said with a calmness that even surprised herself. "I'll leave. But you're going to regret this decision, David." She turned without saying another word and went upstairs, leaving David and Jessica alone. The pain in her chest was unbearable, but Emily knew she had to keep her head held high. When she entered the bedroom, which now felt strange and distant, she finally allowed the tears to fall. Sitting on the bed, she looked at the suitcase that David had left behind and felt completely empty. Emily didn't know what she would do next. She had no plan, no idea how to move forward. All she knew was that the home she had built with so much love was destroyed. But as the pain consumed her, a small seed of determination began to grow inside her. She wouldn't let that betrayal define her. Not now, not ever. Emily woke up the next morning with the weight of the world on her shoulders. The empty space beside her in bed was a cruel reminder of the reality she now faced. The house that once symbolized a happy marriage now felt cold and lifeless. With every step she took through the bedroom, she felt David's absence transforming into a suffocating presence, as if the walls were closing in around her. She walked downstairs slowly, trying to prepare herself for what should have been a normal morning. But nothing was normal that day. When she entered the kitchen, she found the coffee maker already cold. She made coffee in silence, the sound of the beans grinding echoing through the empty house. Emily sat at the table with her cup of coffee, but the aroma that usually comforted her no longer had the same effect. Everything had changed. As she sipped her coffee, Emily tried to focus on the things she needed to do. Getting ready for work seemed like a monumental task, but she knew she couldn't afford to give in to despair. She needed to keep her head held high, to move forward even though everything inside her wanted to scream. After getting ready, Emily grabbed her bag and headed out to work, trying to push thoughts of David and Jessica out of her mind. The commute felt longer than usual, and when she finally arrived at the office, she was greeted by her colleague and friend, Sophie. Sophie immediately noticed that something was wrong. "Emily, are you okay? You seem distant," Sophie asked, concerned. Emily hesitated for a moment before sighing and deciding to tell the truth. "David left me, Sophie. He's with another woman. She's pregnant, and he gave me a month to move out." Sophie was silent for a few seconds, shocked by the revelation. "My God, Emily, I can't believe this. How could he do this to you?" "I can't believe it either," Emily replied, feeling the tears begin to threaten again. "But I don't know what to do. He said the house is his, that I need to leave." Sophie, still stunned, tried to think of something to help. "Have you talked to a lawyer? Maybe there's something you can do." Emily shook her head. "No, I don't even know where to start." Sophie reached into her purse and handed Emily a business card. "Here, this is the contact of a divorce lawyer. He's very good. I think you should talk to him, see what your rights are." Emily looked at the card for a moment before putting it in her bag. "Thank you, Sophie. I'll do that." At lunch, Emily decided she couldn't put it off any longer. She called the lawyer's office and managed to schedule a consultation for that afternoon. She didn't know what to expect, but she felt she needed guidance. She needed to know where she stood. When she arrived at the lawyer's office, a middle-aged man named Robert Emily was greeted with an understanding look. "Mrs. Harper, please come in and have a seat," he said, indicating the chair in front of his desk. Emily sat down, still a bit nervous. I don't know exactly what to do. My ex-husband, actually wants me to leave the house. He's with another woman, and she's pregnant." Robert nodded, listening attentively. "I see. And is the house in his name?" "Yes," Emily replied, her throat tightening. "He bought it before we got married." Robert flipped through some papers on his desk before continuing. "Well, since the house was acquired before the marriage, legally, it belongs to him. Unfortunately, he has the right to ask you to leave." Emily felt the ground open up beneath her again, but she remained calm. "But I bought all the furniture. I decorated the house. If he's going to keep the house, I want the money for the furniture." Robert looked at her with a slight smile. "That's something you can do, yes. In fact, while you're still legally married, you have the right to sell the furniture or replace it if you want. You live there, and until the divorce is finalized, you still have that right." Emily was surprised for a moment, processing the lawyer's words. "So, I could sell all the furniture, and he wouldn't be able to do anything about it?" Robert nodded. "Exactly. Legally, you can. And if there have been any renovations in the house, you can also make changes, as long as it doesn't affect the main structure. It's the right of the person living in the house." A new sensation took hold of Emily. It was as if a small spark had been ignited in the darkness. She didn't know exactly what she would do, but she now knew that she had options. She had power. "Thank you, Robert," she said with renewed determination. "You don't know how much this means to me." As Emily left the lawyer's office, her mind began to work. She was still devastated by David's betrayal, but now there was a small flame of revenge burning in her chest. Maybe she didn't have to leave that house empty-handed. Maybe she could do something that would make David and Jessica regret it for the rest of their lives. Emily returned home that night with renewed determination. Each step she took toward the door felt more confident, more assured. The conversation with the lawyer Robert had opened her eyes to the possibilities she still had at her disposal. David wanted her to leave, but he had no idea that she could turn the tables. The next morning, Emily began to act. She wouldn't waste time. With the house empty and David now living in Jessica's apartment, she had the freedom she needed. She started by selecting the furniture in the house, every piece that she had personally chosen and bought over the years. Those pieces of furniture held memories, but now they were just reminders of a past she wanted to leave behind. She took photos of the furniture and began posting them on online selling sites, creating ads with detailed descriptions. Within days, the responses started to come in. Emily was surprised at how quickly she was able to sell most of the furniture, and with each sale, she felt stronger, more in control of the situation. During her free afternoons while waiting for buyers, Emily began making subtle changes to the house. First, she changed the locks, ensuring that David couldn't enter without her permission. She also replaced the curtains with something simpler, depersonalizing the space that had once been so familiar. Then she began painting the walls with dark, close colors, giving the place an oppressive atmosphere that matched the emotional chaos David had caused. Every change was a small revenge, a symbolic gesture that represented her pain and her determination to move forward. She was creating an environment that David and Jessica wouldn't recognize when they finally returned. Meanwhile, David and Jessica began facing the first difficulties in their new life together. The emotional honeymoon they had expected was interrupted by small tensions that soon turned into major arguments. Jessica, who had promised David a perfect life, began to show her true colors. Small lies started to accumulate, and the pregnancy that Jessica claimed became a shadow over their relationship. David, who had once been blinded by the promise of a family, began to realize that something was wrong. Jessica was avoiding medical appointments, always postponing visits to the doctor with flimsy excuses. What had started as a dream was turning into a growing nightmare, and doubts began to erode the trust he had in her. While David dealt with the harsh and disillusioning reality of his new relationship, Emily was thriving. She wasn't just selling the furniture to make money, she was selling a past that no longer served her. And with each sale, she felt stronger, closer to rebuilding her life. One day, as she watched one of the last pieces of furniture being carried away by a buyer, Emily felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. For the first time since David announced his betrayal, she felt she had control over her own destiny. She knew there was still a long way to go and that the decisions she made now would shape the rest of her life. But she was ready. Ready to face whatever came, ready to free herself from the weight of the past. David felt something was wrong. Ever since he moved into Jessica's apartment, his life had become a silent chaos. The promises of happiness and a perfect family were unraveling with each passing day. Jessica was becoming more evasive, and the arguments between them were becoming more frequent. He didn't want to admit it, but something in his life was completely out of control. After yet another heated argument about the pregnancy, David decided he needed to step back and think. And instinctively, he thought that visiting his house might bring him some comfort, perhaps a sense of normalcy that had disappeared. So, without warning, he drove to the house he once shared with Emily. However, as soon as he parked the car and looked around, he felt that something was deeply wrong. The garden, which had always been immaculate and blooming under Emily's care, was now unrecognizable. The flowers had disappeared, replaced by dry, thorny bushes that seemed to reach out like threatening fingers. As he approached the front door, the feeling of unease only grew. He took out his keys and tried to open the door, but the lock resisted. Confused, he tried again, but without success. It was then that he realized the locks had been changed. Irritation and frustration began to boil inside him. Emily had taken steps to exclude him from his own home. With no other option, David rang the doorbell, his temper already on the verge of exploding. After a few moments, the door opened, revealing Emily standing in the doorway. Her serene expression only fueled David's anger. "Why did you change the locks, Emily?" "And what happened to the garden?" he asked, his voice laden with frustration. Emily shrugged, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I made some changes," she replied in a neutral tone. "After all, you gave me a month, remember?" David looked more closely at her face, searching for any reaction that showed remorse, but all he saw was calculated calm. He looked over her shoulder and noticed that the house was dark, the daylight barely penetrating the closed curtains. "What the hell did you do here?" he asked, pushing the door to force his way in. As he crossed the threshold, David was hit with a greater shock than he had imagined. The interior of the house, which had once been cozy and full of life, was now gloomy and desolate. The walls, once painted in soft, cheerful colors, were now dark, almost oppressive. The furniture that Emily had chosen with so much care was simply gone. In its place was a palpable emptiness that reflected the chaos David felt inside. "Emily, you sold all the furniture? You painted the walls black?" he exclaimed, unable to believe what he was seeing. Emily followed him into the living room, where he stopped in the center, looking around as if he were in a nightmare. "The furniture was mine," she said calmly. "I bought it, so I sold it. As for the painting, I thought the house needed a change. And as you said, I still live here, and while we're legally married, I can do whatever I want." David felt his blood boil in his veins. "You did this to provoke me, to ruin everything." Emily looked at him without losing her composure. "I did what I had to do, David. You kicked me out, brought your lover here, and told me to find a new place to live. I'm just preparing for that. If you don't like the changes, maybe you should have thought better before making your decisions." David was silent, trying to process her words. He knew that Emily was within her rights, but the anger and regret he felt were like a storm in his chest. Part of him knew he had made a huge mistake, but he was too proud to admit it to her or to himself. "You're going to regret this, Emily," he finally said, but the strength behind his words seemed weakened. "Maybe," she replied with a small smile. "But I'm already rebuilding my life, and you're still stuck in yours." David looked at her one last time before leaving the house, slamming the door behind him. What had once been his security and comfort was now a place of confusion and discomfort. He knew something was terribly wrong with his life, but he still couldn't find the courage to face the truth. As he walked away, Emily stood at the door, watching him disappear. She knew this was just the beginning. David was starting to face the consequences of his actions, and Emily was finally beginning to regain control of her life. The deadline David had given Emily was finally coming to an end. Over the past month, Emily had dedicated each day to preparing for her new life away from the house that had once been her home. She found a small apartment in a quiet part of town, enough for her to start over without the memories that haunted the old house. The move was an emotional process, but with each box she packed and carried, she felt the weight of the past lightening. On the last day of the deadline, Emily took one last look at her old house. The dark walls and empty rooms no longer made her feel like she was losing something. On the contrary, she felt she was finally leaving behind a chapter that needed to be closed. With the last box in the car, she took a deep breath and drove to Jessica's apartment, where David was living. When David answered the door, he looked different, as if something in his life was out of control, but Emily kept her composure. She held out her hand with the keys to the house, which jingled lightly between her fingers. "Here are the keys," she said, her voice firm but without bitterness. "Enjoy your new life." David took the keys, and for a moment, their eyes met. He opened his mouth to say something, but nothing came out. Emily just nodded, giving him a small smile before turning around and walking away without looking back. David stood at the door, watching Emily leave until she disappeared from sight. He felt a strange sense of loss but refused to let that feeling grow. He closed the door and went back inside, where Jessica was already preparing things for the move. When they arrived at the old house, it was empty, dark, and cold, exactly as Emily had left it. In the center of the living room was just a single box. David walked over, intrigued, and opened the lid. Inside, He found photo albums, souvenirs from trips he and Emily had taken together, and other small items that brought a flood of memories. Jessica looked over his shoulder without much interest. "Do you want to keep these things?" David, with a lump in his throat, closed the box. "I'll put it in the basement for now," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. He knew that those memories belonged to a life he had decided to abandon, but keeping them in the basement seemed like a way not to completely sever ties with the past. As David carried the box to the basement, Jessica began walking around the house, muttering about all the changes she wanted to make. The dark walls bothered her, and she was already planning new colors, furniture, and decorations to make the place more her style. But even as she made plans, there was a tension in the air that she couldn't ignore. Something was wrong, and a shadow hung over their relationship, something that not even the most vibrant colors could dispel. Meanwhile, in her new apartment, Emily was starting to adjust to her new life. It was a modest place but full of possibilities. Every corner, every wall was free of painful memories, and that filled her with a sense of freedom she hadn't felt in a long time. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in months, she felt she was finally in control of her own destiny. Emily unpacked and began organizing her things, realizing that this new space was a blank canvas ready to be filled with new memories and new experiences. And most importantly, she knew she was alone but not lonely. There was a difference, and that difference was what made her feel at peace. A few months had passed since Emily left the old house, and she had fully adapted to her new life. The small apartment that she now called home was a cozy space full of possibilities. Emily had transformed that place into a refuge, and over time, she rediscovered her strength and independence. She was thriving, and the past no longer weighed so heavily on her heart. Meanwhile, the life of David and Jessica in the old house was far from what they had envisioned. The tension grew with each passing day, especially as the pregnancy Jessica had claimed became a lie that was increasingly difficult to maintain. She continued to make excuses to avoid medical appointments, but David was becoming more and more suspicious. "Jessica, seriously? It's been months, and we haven't gone to a single real appointment." "This isn't normal," David insisted, his concern turning into frustration. "David, please, I'm scared," Jessica replied, her voice trembling. "I'm afraid of losing the baby. What if something's wrong? I don't want to face that." David tried to be understanding, but Jessica's excuses were starting to sound less and less convincing. Doubt was eating away at him. Determined to get answers, he decided to go personally to the clinic where Jessica claimed to be receiving care. When he arrived at the clinic, David explained the situation to the receptionist. "I'm here to check my wife Jessica's records. She said she's been seeing a doctor here." The receptionist typed Jessica's name into the system, and after a few seconds, she looked at David with a confused expression. "I'm sorry, sir, but we don't have any record of a patient named Jessica. There's nothing in the system." David frowned, the tension in his body increasing. "This must be a mistake. She said she was being treated here. Could you check again, please?" The receptionist did another search, but the result was the same. "I'm sorry, sir, but there's no Jessica registered here. Maybe she mentioned another place?" David felt the blood freeze in his veins. Reality hit him with overwhelming force. "No! There must be some mistake. I need certainty. She She was never pregnant, was she? The receptionist, sensing the seriousness of the situation, looked at David with sympathy but also firmness. "Sir, if she had been a patient here, she would be in the system. There are no records." David left the clinic as if in a trance. The revelation struck him hard. Jessica had lied the whole time, and he, in his blindness and desire for a family, had completely fallen into her trap. He drove back home in silence, his mind spinning with a mix of anger, disappointment, and regret. When he arrived home, he found Jessica in the living room, sitting on the couch. He entered without saying a word, his steps heavy on the wooden floor. Jessica immediately sensed that something was wrong. "David, what happened?" she asked, trying to sound innocent, but her voice trembled. "You were never pregnant," David said, his voice low and filled with restrained fury. "I went to the clinic. They have no record of you. There was never a baby, was there?" Jessica turned pale, knowing there was no longer any way to maintain the lie. "David, I can explain." "Explain what?" "How you destroyed my life because of a lie. How you made me throw away everything I had with Emily." David shouted, his anger overflowing. Jessica, seeing that she was cornered, grabbed her things and stood up. I didn't want things to get to this point. I just wanted you to choose me. You ruined everything, Jessica. Everything. And now I'm alone in this empty house, with nothing, with no one. You destroyed me, he said, his voice heavy with deep pain. Without another word, Jessica grabbed her things and left the house, slamming the door behind her. David stood in the living room, surrounded by the dark walls that now seemed to suffocate him. He was alone, bitter, reflecting on the price of his choices. The memories of Emily, stored in the basement, now haunted him, reminding him of everything he had lost. Meanwhile, Emily was living her new life with serenity. She had left the past behind and fully adapted to the present. The choices David made led him to loneliness and regret, while Emily flourished, free from the weight of a relationship that had imprisoned her. The months that followed were a lesson in humility and regret for David. Living alone in the empty house, he realized what he had lost. He tried to contact Emily several times, but all attempts were in vain. He didn't know where she was living, and even if he did, he understood that it was too late. The memories he kept in the basement were now his only companions, a constant reminder of what he had sacrificed for an illusion. David began to live more introspectively, away from the fantasies that had led him to make his mistakes. He began to reflect on the decisions he had made and the person he had become. He knew he needed to rebuild his life from scratch, but this time he was determined to do so with honesty and integrity. Slowly, he began to get involved in community activities, trying to find some purpose in helping others, hoping that he could at least partially redeem the mistakes of the past. Meanwhile, Emily's life was the complete opposite. She was flourishing, living with a serenity and joy she hadn't felt in a long time. Her small apartment, now decorated with everything that reflected her new life, was a real home. She surrounded herself with new friendships and rediscovered passions she had set aside during the marriage. Emily also began to get involved in social projects, using her own experience to help other women who had gone through similar situations. Emily felt free, as if she had been reborn. The scars of the past were still there, but they served as reminders of her strength and resilience. She had found peace and happiness in her own company, and the future seemed bright and full of possibilities. Jessica, on the other hand, faced a harsh reality after the breakup with David. The life she imagined having with him never materialized, and her manipulation destroyed everything around her. She tried to reconcile with David in a moment of desperation, but he rejected her, knowing that any attempt to rebuild something with her would be futile and toxic. Over time, Jessica began to realize the weight of her choices. She deeply regretted what she had done, not only for the suffering she caused David and Emily but also for ruining her own life. She tried to get back on her feet, but the lies she told left her scarred. Jessica moved on, but with deep scars, carrying the regret of her actions and the emptiness left by her destroyed illusions. While David faced the arduous path of starting over, Emily was far beyond that, building a life full of meaning and purpose. And so, the story of both ended with a clear message: the true value of life does not lie in chasing fantasies but in finding peace within oneself and learning from the lessons the past offers. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment, and check out our next story.